We may have just played the perfect expansion. I know you clicked on this thinking, okay, what's this all about? We just had the chance to play the expansion to Vale of Eternity. It's called Artifacts, and let me just get my bias out there. Vale of Eternity is one of my favorite games in recent memory. It was my #1 game last year. I've been looking very much forward to this. However, I am trying to set all of that aside, and Ryan and I were having a little bit of a philosophical conversation about what is a good expansion? What is a great expansion? What is, dare I say, a perfect expansion?
Yeah, and this is a tough thing to grapple with for me, for one reason, and I'll just jump out and start with this because we can kind of guide the conversation around this. When a game is like a 7, and you play an expansion, and that expansion brings the game up to a 10, you're like, whoa, like this expansion has made, like, this is amazing. Has made everything about this game that I didn't like good, and it's very pronounced. It stands out. But what happens when the game starts at a 10, which
close for many
close
people
to it, which for me, Vale of Eternity was
up
already
there.
up there
It's
because
up there.
it does what it promises, and it after 20 plus plays at this point, the game has maintained.
Yeah, we don't get tired of it.
Everything I love about it, and so it's difficult when a game is already at a 10. When you're looking at the expansion, it's like, well, how much better can it make? Does it need to make the game better, or does it need to just give you more?
Exactly.
And that's kind of the balance.
And we talked about this a little bit, even when we did the review for Vale of Eternity, and we talked about Vale of Eternity when it came out, our first thought was like, oh, what could the expansion have? And what we both landed on was more. Like, we want more. Like, there wasn't anything necessarily that was like, oh, could they do this? Could they do this? We did talk about, like, oh, could there be another family of cards? Yeah. And there's a lot of complications there. We figured, that might be tricky given the balance of the game and everything. But this expansion has come along, and after we played it, Ryan said, and this is what he was just getting at, some of those expansions that come out, you're like, oh, I'd never play without this. Like, if it fixes a game, or if it makes a game much better, obviously you'd never play without this. This one's tricky because would I play Vale of Eternity if someone had it but didn't have the expansion? Of course. I love Vale of Eternity.
Right.
With that said, if this expansion's sitting on the table as well and someone says, do you want to play Vale of Eternity? I have the expansion. 100% I'm playing with the expansion.
Yeah, and I think this goes against what I normally say, which is a lot of times I'll say, play the base game and then bring the expansion maybe for the second or more play. I think that does not apply here. I think you're right. If you have artifacts, you will use it every single time.
Even with a new player,
Even with a brand new group.
It does add a little bit, but not so much that a new player would be like, oh, I don't know what's going on.
No, not so much, because for one thing, it adds a ton more cards, which for me, for both of us, I would say as experienced Vale players, it's good to have new cards. There's that moment when you flip a card and you're like, ooh, this one's new. Let's hover over it and read it and think about how it can interact with all these other cards. But a new player it's not gonna matter how many new cards are added. It doesn't increase the complexity of the game for a new player. But the artifacts part of it might a little bit, but it really just gives you one more action to take.
Yes.
And it's not like you're taking 20 different actions. There's only like 2 or 3 things you're possibly doing on your turn. So adding a fourth, I don't think is like a huge teach overload.
So let's dig down into what this does bring to the table, because if you're still watching the video, you're probably sitting there saying, okay, but what does it do? Well, Ryan just alluded to one aspect, and that is it has more cards. The base game had 70 cards. This one adds 28 more cards. We did the math. That's 40% more
that's
cards.
I mean, that's quite a bit.
And when we talked about this, when they first broke news on this, we were thinking, will there be cards? What are these artifacts? Is it just going to be the artifacts? How are they going to add more cards? Well, they added a lot more cards. I think each of the families except the dragons has, 6 more cards. And then the dragon only has 4 more cards. And if you know the game, you'll understand why. The dragons are kind of a unique family.
They're a little rarer.
Relative to the other ones. But these cards, first of all, offer a lot more of what you'd seen, different things, different twists on things. We played with some of them where, and it's amazing to play Vale of Eternity now and look at a card and go, no, I don't think I'll take that one. And then someone takes it and you're like, oh, that is kind of cool. Like, and that's one of the things I'll say too about that whole new player experience. Tell me if you agree with this. The fact that there are more cards almost helps to level the playing field between veteran players and new players, because even if you get used to all these cards, there's more cards. So you're not used to seeing the same ones as frequently as you did in the base game.
That's true. I mean, we've played this game so many times so that you do get to a point where you can start to recognize, okay, that card can be great if, the other card comes out. And you might take it and just waiting for that second card to come out. And, a new player is not going to be able to forward think and think, okay, well, I'm setting up an engine. They're just grabbing cards. So I think in that aspect, it is true. There's a good portion of this deck that you're all going to be discovering for the first time.
Yeah.
And I do like that it's not just, okay, well, we have artifacts now, so we're going to throw in a couple cards that reference artifacts that might get buried in there. They didn't do that. These cards are more of what the base cards do, but they interact with cards both in their same family and even now outside of those families in different ways. Things that you didn't score before, like having cards in your hand maybe, or like having a certain amount of stones. Like they just do new playful things in that same area. And again, we've not played enough to even see all of the combinations that are now presented with those new cards.
Yeah, one of the simple ones that came up, this one here, Hephaestus, had just a unique power we hadn't seen in the base game, or at least a twist on it, where it says, lose one of the following 3 things, but gain the other 2.
Which is cool.
And you have to do these things, right? This is one of those resolution powers. So if you have some options, I could have lost 2 points to get a blue stone and 3 reds, or I could get rid of 3 reds to get 2 points and 1 blue. Like, there's a lot of interesting twists there. Not to mention, I fired this off at times, not just during the resolution, but I played a card that really helped glue some things together. And speaking of gluing things together, the artifacts, where the expansion gets its name, is a whole new thing. So there's these artifact tiles, and there's a bunch of them. There's going to be a handful that you use at 2-player, and then a few more that you had for 3 and 4-player, and then there's a bunch of random artifacts that you're always going to use 3 of those. Yeah. We've got 6 of them out here for a 2-player game. At the beginning of every round, the first player is going to take their token and put it on an artifact where they didn't already use. So at the beginning of the game, you're just going to place it on an artifact. But later, the second round, I'll have to move it from this artifact specifically to another artifact. So you effectively just can't go to an artifact that you just used the last round. So these are effectively 6 powers. Some of them are instant. Some of them you can use during the action phase that you're going to be able to utilize during your turn potentially, or at the beginning of the round, to really help make something happen for you.
And it really does. It does.
100%.
It makes a lot happen. I mean, some of these are just giving you gem or stones for, like, discard a card to get some stones, or one that we had upgrades the value of your stones. They do introduce one new mechanic though, which is the reserve. It gives you this neat
shelter.
little shelter. Yeah, you can reserve cards in your shelter, and then from there, there's maybe some things that are going to discard cards from there, or find ways to draw them back up. And I will say, with these artifacts, there are some that you're going to see every single game, but there are some that you won't, because there's a set amount and then there's a set of random ones. The interactions between the set and the random are going to change every single game, and they're also going to change with the cards that are in your tableau. So, David, you put it this way. You almost said it's like having 6 more cards that you can choose to trigger at specific times. Yeah. And it does kind of feel like that.
Yeah, one at a time. Okay, what card would I like to have in my tableau this round? And if you're first player, you have first pick, of course. But again, like I said, you can't pick the same one. So you can't sort of abuse something. There's some here that say, this one says draw a card or retrieve all cards. And retrieve is a new word that lets you take all the cards there, in that case, from your shelter into your hand. The shelter is kind of this limbo space where it's not a played card. It's also not in your hand yet. There's also cards that let you take discard cards from your shelter to get things. The artifacts give you a bunch of different flavor. And really, I was having a fun time. Ryan beat me in our first play, but I was having a fun time exploring sort of what these things allowed us to do. And I would also say, this may just be coincidence, but we have a lot of games of Vale of Eternity under our belts. I've never seen a game where I've never gone heavy on green, and I happen to go heavy on green this time, but I've never done it. And I have to think, that it has to do with the new balance in that deck. There's going to be cards, when I play a game, maybe not at 2-player, but if you're playing this at 3 and 4-player, you're going to get through that deck of the base game. And you're going to see effectively all of the cards in the game. Not now. There's going to be imperfect information where you're like, well, I can't count on that crazy blue engine that I always like to play when I can.
Which you do play a blue engine
I do.
normally.
I gravitate towards the blue. We saw extraordinarily little blue come out in this game. And I think, for me, that adds a lot of interesting flavor to the game that, again, reminds me of Seasons. And I've always said this feels like almost like a distant cousin or little brother or sister to Seasons. And it gives me that flavor because you're like, okay, well, we're not getting that, so what can I do? And then maybe you do, and maybe you score points and you win the game that time. Maybe you don't, but the game is pretty quick and you can reset. So it doesn't feel bad when you don't get that thing to happen. And on the flip side, Ryan got a red engine, which I've never seen you do to this extent.
Not to this extent. I got some new cards that really helped. And this, again, is going to reference some stuff we've never seen before. Like this guy, if you have 4 stones during the scoring phase, you get 2 points. If you don't have 4 stones, you get extra stones. So you get up to a total of 4 stones. And I had another new guy.
Is that Fire Blast?
Yeah, the Fire Blast. Yeah. If you have 4 stones, you recover. So that's 2 new cards that now change the way that I played, because now I'm balancing like, okay, I'm spending stones, I'm trying to get stones, I'm trying to end my turn with maybe having 4 stones so that this guy bounces, because every time I play him, I score points. And he wanted me to have a bunch of fire guys because he scores for pairs, which is, again, not something we've seen. So that's just one example of like 2 new cards that I got gave me a completely different and new engine that scored me some significant points. And I will say, too, speaking of points, this expansion, these artifacts do make it easier to get points because they just set you up for bigger turns. Because of that, they've actually increased the game in score to 80 because they assume that you're going to have higher scoring games just because of these abilities being so good. Now,
well, also the cards. The new cards, I think, also open up a lot more scoring possibilities for all the different families. One thing I've noticed now, I am kind of an old dog who doesn't like new tricks. I do go with that blue engine a lot. But I will say, I think one of the things they did here is they've injected a little bit more fun with some cards that happen in each of the families that allow those families to have better point scoring engines that are more readily apparent to any player who looks at the cards.
I mean, the new cards are good. But the new cards plus the artifacts, I mean, we're already looking at vastly different games of Vale. In fact, it's very rare that I would look back and say, okay, well, I played the exact same game. I used the exact same strategy. Maybe some bits and pieces, but it's very difficult to get the exact same engine multiple games. That's going to be even more difficult to do with these artifacts because you might not even get the same artifact. Like, you might have found a card that works really well. Like this one that draws me a card. I had a guy that whenever I draw a card, he comes back to my hand. So it's like, I want to draw cards, get him back, play him again, and score more points. But that card, I might not get that card with that particular artifact next game. You really can't just try to play the same game over and over and over again.
No, and speaking of cards, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet is the fact that you can purchase, through a number of different ways, extra space for your cards. So if you've played the game, you know that you can have a number of cards summoned equal to the round number. So in round 1, you can have 1. If you get to round 10, you can never really have more than 10 cards. Well, now there's a couple of the artifacts out here that allow you to get one of these extra space tiles. When you get one initially, it says +1. So basically, if it's round 6, I can have 7 cards. If you get it again, you just flip that tile over, and now you have +2, which is where it caps. Each player can have up to 2 additional spaces. But this is amazing because
up to 12 summons.
You could have up to 12 cards at the end of a 10-round game. But more importantly, in the 5th round, you could have 7 cards.
Which is huge.
And those engines that you build, you could just have activating sooner. You could have a lot more cards out there. I had a situation where I even had these 2 extra spaces. I was nearly up to my limit. Then I played a card that let me get rid of 3 cards, and the amount of space that I had then was insane. Like there was a point mid to late game that I was like, oh, I could play 5. I have space for 5 cards now.
3 or 4 cards in one go.
And I made a valiant effort at it. I didn't catch Ryan. We had crazy engines. Our points were both pretty high in a 2-player game. Obviously, goes up to 80 now, but I had 80 or 67?
You had 67 and I had 82.
Yeah. So Ryan just got away with me, away from me with
I
that
had a
engine.
pretty solid engine happening here, which is what you're looking for in a game. But now that we've kind of talked about what comes in the game and how it kind of changes the game, I don't want to get away from the video because I don't want you to accuse us of clickbaiting you. Because
No.
we really were having this discussion of like, what does make a perfect expansion? And I think that definition is going to be different for everybody. But this feels a lot to me like what Cascadia Landmarks did, where it introduced more without changing the parts that you love about the game.
Agreed.
Because everything is still here.
I would add to that this does, I think, a little bit beyond that, because I do think it gives you more, but I do think it adds to the game in some very basic ways that feel fundamentally different. The fact that you can have potentially more cards in your tableau feels fundamentally different. The fact that there's this whole shelter area that you can manage with your cards. And when I say manage, it is really something you can utilize, because a lot of the artifacts allow you to kind of use that shelter to make some of those things happen that you want to happen. This shelter is kind of this interesting new sub-hand, if you will, that really opens things up. The more part of it is all the cards. Like and the rule book says, you can just play with all the new cards. You don't have to even have the artifacts in play. You can play them. The cards don't sort of rely on the artifacts.
That's something I mentioned earlier that I think is very important, because I've seen expansions where it's like, ooh, here's a cool new thing. Here's artifacts, and we're going to put a bunch of cards that interact with artifacts. And then when you shuffle, they'll end up in the bottom of the deck. So by the end, you're like, we just played Vale. We didn't draw a single card. So even like the shelter that David's referring to, most of that management is done through the artifacts. You're not relying on drawing cards that interact with the shelter. You can interact with your shelter from turn one because there are artifacts out here. And we said in a 4-player game, there is a set amount that you're always using, and then the random ones. Within those set amount, there are always going to be at least one that interacts with your shelter in a unique way. So you're getting to use the new mechanics right away. And if we didn't make this clear, like David said, there's no cost to using these. You just get to use one every turn. And so again, you're jumping right into the artifacts right away. It's not like halfway through the game, oh, I finally got a card that lets me put my thing out there and grab an artifact.
Right.
You're jumping, like, you're getting that part of the fun right from turn one.
And there are some crazy artifacts. Actually, Ryan and I played with these, and then we looked through the ones that we didn't play with, at least the random ones. And there are ones that I was like, oh, wow, this would have been crazy for what we had going on. There's one here, too. Like we said earlier, some of these happen the instant you choose them. Some of them happen whenever you want to use them on your round once. This one here is an ongoing power that you have for the rest of that round. So it says after you sell a card, you may pay 1 red stone to add the sold card back to your hand.
That's insane.
So like, oh, I'll sell that for 6. Oh, actually, I'll pay 1 to get it back.
Yeah, right.
That's crazy. And especially with your engine, it would have been really sick.
But again, you can't use these more than one turn in a row. You have to use it, then you have to go to somewhere else, then maybe you can come back to it. So there is a limit to these powers. Even the ones that feel really broken, you can't just take advantage of them.
Well, and even if they are a little broken feeling, everyone has them. Yeah, like you said, you can't use it twice, but everyone can learn from each other, because once someone uses it and uses it in an interesting way, everyone else at the table is like, I'm going to do that next turn. Like you can do a lot of interesting things, again, because they don't necessarily rely too much on the exact cards you have and the artifacts. It really just kind of lets any player interact with those artifacts. Now, like Ryan said, back to the idea of a perfect expansion, I'm going to say this. This is one thing we haven't touched on. I would say, after playing this expansion, I can't imagine another expansion for this game that would be wildly different or better. It would just maybe be more
artifacts, more cards.
Maybe more artifacts, but I'd have to say the deck now is what, at 98?
90-something cards, yeah. 98
cards. That's a good amount of cards, right? Like if you did another 28 cards in an expansion in a 2-player game, you're going to have very imperfect information. Like you're going to get some random cards, and it is going to get into that seasons territory with all the expansions where there's so many wild cards. It might get a little crazy. My point being, is the perfect expansion the last expansion you need?
Yeah, I have a feeling I could see them doing one more.
Well, because of the success of the game.
Well, not just because of the success of the game, but I think the way that they've even made the box, the way that the artwork connects to one side of the box, that leaves the other side of the box open for maybe another. I would love to see
Brian's
that.
always looking for panoramic box images.
I do like panoramic box images, but I do see that this could maybe get one more expansion. I don't know what it would have. I would never want something that took the game out of this weight level. I would never want something
agreed.
that overwhelmed players. But I think there could still be, there's still room here.
I'm sure, yes, sure, there is still room. I would say, though, this delivers more than I expected it to deliver. Yeah. When we initially talked about it, I thought it was just going to be just some tiles when they mentioned that it was artifacts. The fact that they added more cards, they increased the point cap to 80 points. They have all the artifacts. They introduced this whole shelter, even the idea of these more spaces for your cards.
There's a lot in this.
There's a lot in this expansion. And for me, I'm going to say it right now, I may have an update later, but this is the perfect expansion. No, and again, remember, I said right at the beginning, very biased. I love Vale of Eternity. I've been very much looking forward to this. But this does exactly what I think it needed to do, and more than what I imagined it would.
Well, and I think even if you don't love Vale of Eternity, even if you're like, man, the game's not for me, the expansion's not for me, being able to recognize when an expansion does exactly what you want it to do, which is introduce new things, some new twists, give you some new challenges to overcome, but does not ratchet up the complexity too much.
And
I think that's and so
give
makes it
you
accessible.
More of what you love.
Yeah, I think that is everything you could ask for in an expansion to a board game.
Ryan's not quite there in terms of calling it the perfect expansion for sure, and that's fine.
I'm going to echo what I said earlier. It's just harder for me to be like, it's good, and I'm like, it's great. The game is great without it.
Yes.
But I will always play with it, but I wouldn't turn down. There are some games, like if we're going to play Terraforming Mars, and I say, do you have Prelude? And you say no, I might go, maybe next time.
But depends on if there's another table you can go play another game at.
If there's another table, I might go, I'm going to go play that other table. But if somebody says, I have Vale but not artifacts, I'm still going to jump into the game.
I would
100%.
I would too, but I'll say it right now. I'd probably be that guy that says, do you have artifacts?
I got artifacts out of my car. I'll go grab it.
Or I might just carry artifacts with me wherever I go. Anyway, if you have any questions at all about it, hopefully we've shown you enough cards and photos. I know we didn't talk about a lot of specific cards. There's a lot of cards here to show, but if you have any questions at all about it, make them in the comments below. We'll be happy to get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, though, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.